Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 What Hepburn lecture. My name is Gary McEwan, and along with my good friend George Yule, we were recently appointed as honorary professors of entrepreneurship at the University of Aberdeen. I'm also CEO of Elevator, which has its HQ in Aberdeen. The What Hepburn lecture series was established back in 2013, following a generous donation from the late Anne Sants. Miss Sants was a graduate of the university and daughter of the late William Watt Hepburn, an Aberdeen businessman who was described as a business genius of his generation, because he was one of the most successful entrepreneurs of that time. His business interests were vast, including the Richards Textile Mill, Kilgour and Walker the Woolen Mill, Northern Agricultural and Lime Company, A. Hall and Company, and a chain of restaurants in Glasgow. Each year the university holds a lecture with the theme of entrepreneurship, and of course this week is Global Entrepreneurship Week, when thousands of events and activities are happening worldwide, each designed to help people explore their potential as a self-starting innovator. So today we'll be hearing how a local businessman has taken a very entrepreneurial approach to this current pandemic. This has been a really challenging year. COVID-19 has had huge impact on all industries across the world. Businesses have had to rapidly adapt their business models to keep the doors open. Figures that came out recently from the ONS showed that the hospitality sector in particular was without doubt the worst hit of all the sectors during the pandemic. And our guest speaker today, Stuart McPhee, has had to innovate and deliver a very entrepreneurial response to the challenges that COVID has presented to his doorstep and also to the entire hospitality sector. Originally from Fife, Stuart worked his way up from being a glass collector in a nightclub to get through university and then become a director of an independent business based in the city centre of Aberdeen, Siberia Bar and Hotel. Stuart's wife Jacqueline and his kids have been the anchor of his entrepreneurial spirit, and he's had to constantly reinvent and adapt to survive over the last 8 months. But Stuart has an incredible passion for his industry and believes that it's one of the most rewarding and dynamic sectors to work in. Stuart's also determined that the voice of the hospitality sector is heard loudly. And so in August this year, Stuart founded the Aberdeen Hospitality Together, set up with the main objective of working together positively and collaboratively with one voice in the sector. So by having an entrepreneurial mindset, Stuart has driven innovation and shown resilience, continuing to introduce new methods to make customers and staff feel safer. Before I introduce you to Stuart, can I just remind you that this lecture is going to be recorded, and throughout the event I would encourage you to use the chat function on the right hand side of your screen to ask questions, because Stuart and I will have a discussion after he's spoken. And I'll aim to get through as many of your questions as we can in the time we have, which is about an hour. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Stuart McPhee to share his thoughts. Stuart.
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction, Gary. Appreciated. It's an honour to be recognised today in being able to give you guys an insight into what's been going on and my response to the pandemic over the last course of the year. One thing that is or was before the pandemic started a big weakness of mine, it was definitely public speaking. So I was never normally the most confident person in getting in front of the camera or in front of an audience to kind of deliver something like this. So it is something that has really kind of come on throughout the pandemic along in my own personal journey. So if I cast everybody's mind back to the start of everything, one of the things that we did as a business at the start of the year was to invest in our hotel room stock at the very, very start of the year in March, well, January, February time. And by the time March came around, we didn't really get anybody in those rooms to get a chance to enjoy them before we were all heading in. And at that time, the emerging theme was uncertainty. Nobody knew what the future was going to look like. And still at this point now, it's very difficult to pin down what it is that the future is going to look like. So uncertainty is the main thing that we've had to try and combat in our response throughout the pandemic. At the very, very start, there was a lot of turmoil within my own team of staff. They were worried about their incomes. They were worried about what was going to be happening in the short term at that initial lockdown. So what we did within our own business was examine how it is that we could look after them in the immediate term. And we examined how we could structure something in the short term to keep them keep their finances going. So we created a scheme that was then similar to the furlough scheme. At that stage, we'd actually managed to create our own mini furlough scheme without even knowing that we had created that as a response to what was happening to try and look after our staff. And we were looking to engage with giving them holiday pay throughout a month-long period so that we could create our own certainty for them. And that in turn allowed us to try and look after them and keep them retained over that time period. And luckily enough, along came the furlough scheme. And that has allowed us to retain our skilled workforce, which has been a fantastic success in terms of financial support. And then we head into the lockdown period, which, you know, that was a roller coaster in itself. It was a extremely challenging time of very, very low productivity, a massive lull in what we would normally do on a day-to-day basis. Personally, it allowed me to spend some unforgettable time with my own family that I would probably have never have gotten given normal circumstances and my normal working pattern of, you know, 7 days a week, no time off, you know. And we really, really did see the benefits of that. And as we built to reopen and we looked around the world to reopen as lockdown sped on, we were looking around the world and we were looking to try and gain understanding as to how other countries were engaging with the pandemic to inform our own responses, looking at route maps that were set out in states in Australia to see how they were planning to reopen the sector, looking at companies in Hong Kong who created various playbooks as to how they would deal with different scenarios that developed as they reopened post-pandemic. And we took little bits of knowledge from around the world and helped use that to inform what it is that we were planning to do when we reopened in July. What we had to do at that point was pivot our traditional offering, which is a vertical drinking bar, 374 capacity, you know, very busy, loud music, people coming and going as they please, to something that was much more controlled, a much more restaurant style service, if you will, all seated, table service, and how we accentuated that offer to allow that to be marketable to customers when we reopened in July. And that was very successful. July was very successful in terms of reopening and in terms of bedding into a new way of working in a new world, and we were learning every day and we were adapting every day, and making small changes here, small changes there, really being very, very reactive and responsive as a business to make sure that we improved as the days went on. And that was seen markedly when we were getting reviews from people saying how well we were doing and how safe we were keeping people and had our priorities in the right place. And that was really encouraging. And through July we went on, and then we found ourselves at the start of August heading into our local lockdown in Aberdeen, as Aberdeen did. And after a lot of positivity around our own business and the way we were operating as an individual, it became apparent that it wouldn't necessarily matter what we did as a business to keep everybody safe. It just takes one thing to go wrong in this current trading climate. So what we've tried to do, or what I tried to do post that, is understand where things went wrong throughout July, you know, and then figure out how it is that we move forward on a better footing. So the frustrations of that kind of lockdown period were culminated in a licensing board summit that was held by Aberdeen City Council, and we were all invited along to it to discuss where it was that we were going as a city after the lockdown, and we never even got to that agenda point on the meeting. It was too busy, everybody worrying about who had done what wrong and why. So what we needed to establish was a clear route forward for us to come back out of lockdown, and we collaborated very well across businesses and across the city to form what is now known as Aberdeen Hospitality Together. So that's a group that I helped co-found. It's volunteers from various organisations making up the committee now, and we represent 141 venues across the city of Aberdeen, and our voice is heard. On a local level, we have weekly discussions with stakeholders such as the Environmental Health Department at the City Council, as well as trading standards, the police, and good dialogue with local council leaders and local business organisations as well. And taking that from a local level and then pushing that forward onto a national level as to how our voice can be heard as a city and restoring our reputation as a city. I now work in two other working groups representing Aberdeen Hospitality Together, which is the Scottish Hospitality Group, who speak directly to Scottish Government on the subject of hospitality, and also the Nighttime Industries Association Commission for Scotland as well, to just broaden our knowledge of our place in the country and how we can help the sector grow again when we get the chance to do so, and being able to inform the decisions that are being made and forced upon us. Throughout all of this, we have been responding to the restrictions that have been put down onto us by Scottish Government when they imposed them. So we've had situations of restrictions in household mixing within the sector. So we were at one trading point, we had the ability to have 8 people over 3 households, and then it came down to 6 people over 2 households. And we had to then mitigate that impact and respond to that particular restriction by changing our table composition within our venue and changing our kind of, you know, booking length, our standard booking length, and looking at how we mitigated that impact in order to continue trading. And we've had various other restrictions that have come into place that we've all had to respond to. And some of the hardest ones that have been difficult to swallow for me has been the ban on background music in venues. I find that very, very difficult to create a response to, because to me, a little bit of music in the background isn't going to cause any harm, but that's my own personal opinion. And all of this, all the while, kind of is underlying with uncertainty. We're getting more restrictions, and we're getting more and more issues that we have to deal with on a daily basis in order to just keep trading and keep open. But we do it with a positive spin, and that's what I've always emphasised with my own business and the team in my own business, is we deal with this in our own way, and our response is dealt with in a positive fashion, and we make sure that we look after the people that it affects in the immediate term. So we always put our staff and our people first. So when we had other things that we've also obviously had to respond to have been things like the weekend where students were banned to come to premises, and we've had to respond to curfews and trading times, and we've had to really nail down how it is we understand our own businesses as hospitality operators. From my own point of view, having as many connections and building up the network that I have done now with the groups that I work at on a national and local level, it's really enabled me to have my finger on the pulse, to fully understand what it is that the impact of a restriction is going to have on us specifically. And in building that business knowledge and having to understand that confidence and know the basic maths of what an impact is going to have allows us to inform our response. So we can know that the impact will be either a financial loss, or the impact will be, you just take the hit and you just keep going to keep people in jobs, or you know that at that point is going to have to be a closure. We had that experience at the start of October, the middle of October, sorry, we had that experience in the middle of October when the circuit breaker lockdown came in, and we were asked as a sector not to sell our primary product, which is alcohol. And in that decision being made, we ourselves had to make the decision as a business in Aberdeen to close, even though that we would not have access to the full funding that people in the Central Belt would have had access to. But we've got to be able to be flexible and make these decisions and be strong in the conviction of making these decisions to say, this is just what we have to do to look after the business so that the business is here, and look after our staff so that our staff can remain engaged and remain in employment in the future. So when we had that lockdown specifically, we focused on, and throughout all of our lockdowns actually, we've focused specifically on the mental health of our team, the mental health of our people, and we've kept them engaged, and we have kept them involved in silly things. One of the guys that was, he's one of our chefs, he decided to create a wrestling simulation of everybody that's involved in the business, and he would play that out over Zoom to all the staff who would get together on a Monday night, and that was something that they all did to keep themselves entertained and keep themselves occupied. And that, there's a lot more value in that than you would probably give credence to when you think it's just a funny subject. And going forward, where we find ourselves now, we're in the tier system. Decisions yesterday affected the way that things are running today. We would like to see some not restructuring of the tiers, but some understanding and some cohesive consultation with the trade as to how the tiers could be tweaked to allow some more viability for businesses. If you look, for example, at the moment in level 3, if you're a restaurant in level 3, for example, you have to close at 6 p.m. That means your last sitting would probably be something around about 4:30 in the afternoon, which if you just had 2-3 hours more trading, then you could become a bit more of a financially viable business. So trying to get those messages over to Scottish Government, using the groups that we have and using that as part of our response to the situation that we find ourselves in, trying to show that we are there to be spoken to. The sector is a very innovative sector. Aberdeen specifically has gone through the mill. It's very, very well documented that we've had a roller coaster of a ride so far in the northeast, specifically in Aberdeen. And what we look like we're planning towards now with staying in level 2 is heading into what I'm classing as a level 2 Christmas. We're planning as a business, that's our response to being in this tier, or this level, sorry. We're going to be working towards a level 2 Christmas. And what that looks like is structuring a menu around that, structuring our bookings around that, and structuring our drinks offering around that, and being able to then market a product on that basis. And then thus we're creating our own certainty, because we know that as we stand just now, if we're in level 2, we can keep doing what we're doing. If we go to level 3, we know that that means closure, so we can react to that. And if we go to level 1, we know that that's a little bit better. So we are trying to forge a course forward in creating our own certainty through some really challenging times. On a personal level, that covers basically a whistle-stop tour of how we've dealt with things as a business and the decisions we've had to make on a daily basis. But we need to, as entrepreneurs and as individuals, we need to keep ourselves motivated, because it's the teams feed off your energy, or your team, your workforce, or your project will feed off your own energy. So if you have a bad day, that's okay. I've seen people in the hospitality industry that I would never expect to be having, not breakdowns, I wouldn't go as far to say breakdowns, but let's just call them bad days, days where they're not motivated, days where they're not at their best. It's okay to have those days, but when what you're trying to work towards is a realization and knowing that you have the right people to speak to at the right times, and that gives you the chance to speak through a problem that you're having to get to a solution. And that's what I found extremely useful on a personal level, having the right people to speak to at the right times who are going through the same problems. That has allowed me to create my own solution or my own slant on a problem, and that has been really, really helpful for me personally. And that can be found through the formation of the groups that I've created, the groups that I've got involved in, the conversations that I've had, the collaboration that we've brought forward. And it really has been the hardest thing has been the ability to get through the tough times and try and seek that clarity, because it's been so unclear at so many points that the fact that I can sit here and say to you now that I have some certainty into Christmas, which is a 6-week trading period, is to me pretty profound in terms of how we've got through the year so far. In a broader sense, I think the hospitality industry on the whole and the economy at large really needs to start plotting a course as to how it is that we do begin to get out of this. We need to start seeing some plans to instigate the way forward and look at how we grow the economy out of this. There's no, in my opinion, that is the best foot forward. We need to look at growth. We need to look at investment in terms of our own business. That's certainly the kind of line of sight that we have going forward. And really, we need to all make sure that we stick together, we share information, and that we show that we are a sector that is willing to engage and that is willing to try and push forward for a better future, not just for the city of Aberdeen, but for the whole country. And the hospitality sector is a very integral part to our day-to-day lives, and a lot of other suppliers as an ecosystem that is alive around the hospitality sector in any town and city that really relies on us to make sure that they can be sustained into the future. So I want to kind of come to a slight conclusion here on how I've kind of got through things in a personal sense, and I'd like to leave my my keynote speech on a quote, and the quote is as follows: "You, me, or nobody is going to get hit as hard as life, but it isn't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. And that's how winning is done." And that's a quote from Rocky Balboa from the film Rocky. And that, to me, seems apt in terms of relating it back to how the hospitality sector has been treated. We will be here at the end of this, and we will keep pushing forward. And I'd like to hand back to Gary on that note and head into the Q&A, and I invite any questions from anybody. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Stuart. That was an amazing insight into what must have been an enormously difficult last 8 months, and we just got a glimpse of probably of the pain that you and your team will have been going through, in fact, in the entire sector within the region. Just on that point about getting hit, you know, it has been a really difficult time for everybody. Especially entrepreneurs thrive on momentum, and when we don't have momentum, I mean, COVID represents a really strong headwind, doesn't it? It's, you know, we're constantly battling against it. How has that headwind affected you personally in respects of doing your job and seeing a way through it? Has it affected your ability to navigate?
At a lot of points it has, yes. It's been very, very difficult to sit and kind of be dictated to on a daily basis as to what you can and can't do by way of press conference. But what we've had to do is analyse what is in front of us. What tools have we been given to try and help us survive? What predictions do we make in terms of where the market is moving? What cultures have shifted during lockdown? What has become the new normals? You know, deliveries, takeaways, food offerings, etc. And what we are trying to analyse and pivot our business towards, and this is obviously specifically related to my own business, is how we accentuate our food offering with a food offering that is more, that adds something to the brand, that adds value to a visit, that adds value to a customer experience, and how we translate that into said offering and what kind of tools we need to give ourselves to do that. So we're kind of marking ourselves up for that by way of investment and growth into the future, which kind of allows us to get a path forward.
Thanks. And so you've obviously led the business. It's been a tough initiation, I guess, for you this year. But leading is really tough even when things are going well. But over the last 8 months, you're not only having to lead yourself, but you're having to lead a team that is, you know, working under very uncertain, trying circumstances. So how have you found shouldering your own momentum and also trying to shoulder the burden of carrying their expectations too?
I think the main thing that gets me through a day is that there's you know, you get up in the morning, you're going to solve that day's problems. Repeat the next day, repeat the next day, repeat the next day. That was kind of my simplified momentum over the period where there was either lockdowns or there has been specific issues that we've had to deal with. It's very much day to day, but the momentum was there to want to get up and to want to solve those problems and to want to make a difference. In terms of team-wise, really, I think I've been fortunate in 2020 to be surrounded by some of the best people. I think I've been in my employment for a number of years, and that's not a slight on anybody who's worked for me before, but some of these guys have really, really stepped up to the plate. They've really shown their own capabilities and their own uniqueness and their own, maybe they've been given more of a chance to do so, I don't know, but they've really come to the fore, and they have really helped bring opinions to the table, helped with risk assessments, used their own voice wisely, you know, if they didn't feel comfortable doing something, it was addressed immediately, because we know the sensitivities around these things, and we know how it is that we would want to be treated in that situation. So we have to look after them as much as we would want to be looked after ourselves. So there's been a real kind of admiration for these guys on my front. Really, they've really come to the fore, as I say.
Yeah, I think once we go back to some kind of normality, we're going to see some of our colleagues in a new light, the ones who really rose to the occasion, and perhaps the ones who were found to be hiding, and maybe they might not have been expected to be like that, but I think we will find something different. But you mentioned when you were speaking about the important element that your family play in that, because they are the anchor point by which, you know, you have to go home and be a dad and a husband, and so Pam had mentioned a question just on the chat just about that family time during lockdown, and has it made you reflect on your work-life balance, and do you think it will lead to any changes when life gets back to some sort of normality?
I don't know, because my wife will tell you I'm a bit of a workaholic, so I do immerse myself in what it is that I do, because for me I don't necessarily know another way of doing it, and that would potentially be my own kind of flaw. But what it has done is really shown me the value of what it is I was missing. So, you know, that kind of story, that bedtime, you know, that bedtime routine, you know, read a storybook to the little man and stuff like that. You know, that's something that I wasn't really doing on a daily basis, or wasn't really part of consistently. So it's kind of shown me and brought to light really the part that perhaps I wasn't playing before, And now that I have the drive to want to play it, and that's not to say I didn't want to play it before, it's more to say that I was, you know, that perpetual saying of I was always busy, you know what I mean? You're always busy until you're not busy. So I think it has made me reassess the work-life balance and priorities for sure, because going forward, the most important thing really is your family, and it is the people around you, and they're the ones that are always there for you. So there's no time like the present to make sure you make that count.
Yeah, these are, I think we will look at things differently when we go back in certain aspects of our lives. It's given us time for reflection. There's a question from Rebecca Buchan. Hi, Rebecca. Nice to see you. It's actually to both of us about what's inspired us in terms of observing other businesses that have managed to pivot their business model in response to the pandemic. You know, because we have seen it's been I think we've developed probably 6 years worth of digital kind of connectivity within 6 months. The way we're all now speaking in this format, we now see chefs doing online cooking lessons, Airbnb with our virtual tours, and there's even church sermons now being delivered online. And you would never have imagined any of these things, but there was a restaurateur in Stirling that I was speaking to, who was delighted because he reckoned that he had pivoted now, and he now had 4,500 tables in his restaurant, because he had effectively decided that his entire community was now his customer, and he would deliver food directly to them. But hospitality doesn't strike me as something that can easily pivot. Have you managed to see anything really good and implement it yourself? Or
I think that imitation is definitely the best form of flattery on that one, for sure. I mean, that's what hospitality is all about. It is seeing ideas, and it is putting your own slant on them. A lot had been made at the start of lockdown about delivery services and about setting up and diversifying in that direction, and that's not something that particularly appealed to ourselves, because we didn't think we would do it justice. So perhaps I've seen more ideas and decided that they're not for me. But I think that was mainly a conscious decision to make to come to that conclusion. There's so much best practice out there. I mean, there's places sending lobster dinners all over the country. Do you know what I mean? They've managed to set that up in a matter of weeks to keep themselves afloat, and it's really admirable to see the resilience that is in the sector, that, you know, they really will go to lengths to just keep going.
Yeah, it's I think if we've learned lots of things in this last 8 months, but the ability of entrepreneurs to think on their feet and quickly change direction has been breathtaking. But it's still a fairly painful experience. But I just wanted to kind of bring in the notion of collaboration, because you mentioned setting up Aberdeen Hospitality Together, which definitely sounds collaborative. And for many sectors, collaboration is a crucially important strategy. But I'm unclear as to what you hope to achieve by that. And I've got a second part to that, because collaboration senses that you're kind of all in it together. But we have seen examples, even lately in Aberdeen, especially, about some hospitality venues going a bit rogue, either not intentionally, of course, but the way that the public behaves, which is one of the questions. It must be a worry within hospitality about, you know, rogue venues that just don't keep control, and people who can't keep control, and then how that affects the collaboration that you're trying to. How does that all work?
So, I mean, it's all very complicated, isn't it? You know, I think if you look at the way that your standard bar is operating, or your standard restaurant is operating now compared to the way it used to, it's all so different. And what we're seeing really is that you can risk assess until you're blue in the face. You can put all the measures in until you're blue in the face. You can train your staff until you're blue in the face, but it takes one person to ruin that. So whether that one person is the customer, who is a huge variable in this situation, especially if there's alcohol involved, which we all understand, and you could have a member of staff that doesn't clean a contact point, or you could, you know, there is variables within any particular scenario. But in terms of collaboration, in your wider point, really what I kind of understand Aberdeen Hospitality Together's point or viewpoint on this general is to be. It feeds into what the Scottish Hospitality Group has come out with. If there are rogue operators in any sector, really, in any sector, rogue operators in any sector, they should be dealt with accordingly. But that's not for the sector to police. That's not for me to sit here and say who is right and who's wrong in any given situation, whether it be customer behaviour or whether it be overzealous operation. There are mechanisms in local authority and law, in licensing law, in general law for the police to become involved with, that if that is the case, then those actions should be taken against those operators or those particular customers. And that in itself was something that, in my assessment of where we found ourselves in our localised Aberdeen lockdown, was something that was advocated. Well, sorry, I wouldn't say advocated. It's something that I would advocate, but it was something that was just not there. And it's still something that I do struggle to see sometimes, that we rely on these mechanisms from our local authority or from police or from whoever to keep everything in check. You know, they're supposed to be there to do that. But sometimes I do question the severity of how it is they engage with that. Take on board that they've got to have a balanced view, because business needs to remain in operation at the end of the day. You know, people need to remain in employment, and I think that that's a really important thing that we do jump to conclusions on, and we do see on social media quite frequently. You know, shut the pubs. You know, shut the pubs because it's all the pubs' fault and they're all tarred with the same brush. But that's thousands and thousands of people's jobs. I mean, UK Hospitality quoted up to the start of November 660,000 job losses in the sector across the whole country. That's 660,000 families, you know, that have experienced job losses. And yes, I understand that that is it's in shrinkingly small amount against somebody who's lost anybody to COVID-19. I do take that fully on board. But the economic hardship that is starting to present itself is going to become a longer term problem than COVID. And that would be where I would see something like Aberdeen Hospitality Together filtering into, to make sure that that economic case is always on the table, and that we can make sure that we can have a sector in the city that is positively represented, that does its best, and that can add value to the city's economy.
Yeah, I mean, it's simply brutal what's happened across hospitality. It's without doubt the real hotspot in all of this. From a kind of non-political perspective, do you feel that government, be it Scottish or UK government, has done enough for the sector, or what would you have liked to have seen them do in the past, or what could they still do to support the sector, do you think?
I think I touched on it slightly just towards the end of what I was saying. In terms of the levels framework that we find ourselves in at the moment, there was token consultation with the hospitality bodies at the outset of when they kind of brought that through towards their parliamentary scrutiny of it on the Tuesday of the week that it was brought through. And what the bodies that I'm involved in did over the weekend in the lead up to that was produce their own version of the framework with a balanced approach, as we always do, because we know we have to balance the harms and mitigate the harms that COVID presents, and put that to the Scottish Government. And if you put the two side by side, what we produced and put forward to them and what was actually produced, there's so many differences that we were just clearly not listened to. And what we had spent our time doing was a complete token gesture for them to say that they had consulted with the sector, but this is what we're going to do anyway. And that, to me, is the hardest pill to swallow, because we're trying to provide a balanced approach that mitigates the harms between the economic harms and the public health harms. And I don't understand, if we're in level 2 in Aberdeen right now, and you're allowed to have alcohol inside my premises up until 8 p.m. with a meal, and the meal's the primary function of you being there, which is easy to operate from my own standpoint, but I know it's difficult for others. What is the difference between somebody then being outside for the 2 hours prior to that, or sorry, the 2 hours post that, up until 10 p.m, I just find it very difficult to understand. And that, to me, across the piece, could be the difference for businesses being viable and not viable.
Yeah, it feels like Aberdeen's maybe even had it rougher, because before COVID we were already in a bit of a hospitality slump, with the oil price, and so there was probably already fragility in the sector in the region. And then COVID comes along, so we're now starting to see, as somebody's just commented at the side, there's some, we've just heard about the Ardo House closure, which is significant. So in light of all of this, how would you judge the general health of the hospitality sector in Aberdeen? Is this, as the person said here, is it a signal of deep sickness, or are we seeing the ones that are already pretty weakened by just generally being killed off by COVID?
That's quite difficult to categorise. I think every business has been impacted uniquely by the pandemic, and if you look over the course of 2020, we've lost 6 major hotels throughout the city centre, and the hotel sector in Aberdeen, and anybody who has a hotel or has experience of working with hotels in Aberdeen, they'll tell you that that's a very specific hotel market, given that we are the oil and gas capital of Europe, and we have a lot of transient workers going offshore and really high kind of business and conference numbers. And what it looks like there really is, we were in a situation before 2020 where there was an oversupply of rooms and room number, like in terms of quantity of rooms in the city versus demand, and that to me seems to be one of the main drivers here, because we know that occupancy was low before the pandemic, and if you were coming online, I know that there are quotes from several hotels that are trading at the moment that their occupancy is running at around about 20%. I mean, there would have been some hotels 2 years ago that be running at 100%. So it's each kind of subsector, if you will, of hospitality faces particularly different challenges, from independents to chain operators to franchises to however large small hotel operators. I think what we are finding though, and it may just be my own observation, is that if you are independently owned and you are a small one-site operation like what I am, slightly easier to pivot and make changes in the immediate term, as opposed to having to go through that kind of head office rigmarole or get approval to do X or approval to do Y. So perhaps the model that large operators advocate may shift more towards giving responsibility, like pushing responsibility down the corporate ladder, essentially, so that people do have that chance to make decisions on the ground that influence the business on a day-to-day basis, that I think I've been quite successful in doing.
Great. And when you talk about perception of the industry, there has always been a perception that hospitality has found it difficult, maybe especially in Aberdeen, to bring in talent, to recruit people into it. How do you think the post-COVID environments, given that people now see how fragile it can be, do you think that's going to be is it going to exacerbate the problem, or do you see other opportunity around recruitment?
That's a loaded question. I think that I've got some people who work for me just now who are extremely talented, but they are worried about a future in the sector themselves, because they see how uncertain it is at this point in time, and they're questioning whether they should be pursuing a career in the industry as it stands right now, given the levels of uncertainty. So I have that problem within my own organisation as it stands, with some really valuable people. Outside of that, there are going to be businesses that have closed that will be putting staff into, well, that staff there will be losing their jobs, that will be putting skilled workers on the unemployment pile, as it were. Are they going to be picked up by other people because they're going to add value to their organisations? I think there's going to be a real shift away from what would have just been a numbers game before pre-COVID, when you just had rotas to fill and you had shifts to fill and you had to get through a week, etc., etc. I think there'll be a real shift, and I know that there's been, specifically for myself, a shift towards adding value to your organization, taking somebody in that you know is going to be coming with ideas, they're going to be motivated, they're going to bed right into what it is that you're asking them to do, as opposed to having to, you know, I'd be remiss to say pick the best of a bad bunch, but you know, the process before would be advertise a job, CVs come in, interview, and then you pick from there. Whereas now it might be more targeted, or you might get wind of somebody who is actually unemployed, and you're like, oh, they'd be great working for me. You know, stuff like that might start happening. I think that there'll be less of an emphasis on having to train people up, and more emphasis on trying to kind of harness these people who may have lost their jobs, I think.
Yeah. Just to pick up another question from the audience, someone's asked if there are any business tactics that you've implemented during the pandemic that have been positive and that you'll continue to use in a post-COVID environment.
Sure. I think one of the main ones is that what I referenced at the start of my talk there was that you would never have seen me in front of a camera before. I was very much a shy and retiring operator who would just stick to washing his dishes on a Saturday and just keep my own business interests to myself and keep ticking all the boxes. Whereas now I see real value in representing the brand that we've created in the right way, and making sure that we are speaking with the right tone, and making sure that we are at the forefront of everything that we can do in the industry, to be the innovators, to be the ones that are pushing the envelope. And I think that before I would have been particularly reluctant to be the face of something like that, just purely on a base that it doesn't suit my skill set. But it's definitely something that I would say that I'd take out of this as a positive, because it's allowed me to develop, and it's allowed me to feel more comfortable, or slightly more comfortable, as it were, doing things like this. You know, being involved in business organisations. You know, some of the groups that I'm talking about on a Scottish level, you know, you're in the room there with some of the biggest operators in the country, some of the big names in the industry, and there's little old me just sitting in the corner, you know, probably the youngest person in the room, you know, probably the least experienced person in the room, but, you know, my opinion matters as much as theirs does, and the impacts that are happening on my business are the exact same impacts that are happening on their business, and they're wanting to pick my brain. And that, to me, is something that is extremely positive that has come out of this. It's I wouldn't necessarily say it's a level playing field, but like historically, you know, industry can be very cliquey, and it can be very difficult for people to infiltrate those kind of things and to make a stand in those kind of areas. So I think there's definitely been a lot of positive work done around that, and it's been really encouraging to see things like Aberdeen Hospitality Together, like the other groups I'm talking about, come together collaboratively to promote the positive aspects of what we do.
I do think that in a crisis, there's the cream tends to rise to the surface, even if it wasn't showing as cream before. So we're very lucky to have, you know, people like you who are prepared to actually break out of your own environment and speak on behalf of a wider audience to a more positive future, which is kind of, as we, I guess, lead towards the end of our hour together, which has gone like a flash. It's maybe time to just talk about the future, which is hopefully on our doorstep, because we often talk about in business, as a business leader, you almost need a microscope and a telescope. You need a microscope to look at, you know, in detail at what's going on inside your business, but you also need a telescope just to look into the distance and think about the scenarios that seem to be playing out and working out how you'll respond to those scenarios. And so these are clearly disciplines that you've talked about today. But how do you, if you look down the telescope of hospitality in our region, what are you seeing?
It's very hard. Yeah, it's very hard to predict. I think, if I'm bluntly honest, that we're probably going to lose more businesses over time, and we're going to see more job losses over time. But I think what we will, or more business closures, I think what we will see, as you just kind of alluded to in your remarks there, is those that have been doing well and that do things well rising to the top and continuing to rise to the challenge and continuing to set themselves apart. The pandemic and everybody's response to the pandemic has been unique to every business up and down the country. Everybody's had their own experience of it, whether that's up into including closures, financial losses. You know, they've all had their own difficulties. And going into the future, I think it's really hard to pin down what it's going to look like. You know, I think there's been some shifts in culture. I think I do worry about the shift towards what I would class as the home culture. You know, everything delivered to your doorstep, so your Deliveroos, your Just Eats, their encroachment on the marketplace of traditional hospitality, you know, wanting to get people up and out and into your venues for a meal as opposed to them just getting the exact same thing delivered to their house, does worry me as a future trend. That, and they can get up to everything, including cigarettes, delivered to their house now. So I think that there's a lot of a particular concern about that. I don't think that the move to, well, I think cafe culture has its positives, but I think it's been a means to an end in order to allow businesses to facilitate social distancing and create trading environments for themselves that allow them to be viable. I don't see a long-term future for that, particularly given the way that it's been implemented. And going forward, you know, I think working together, and the difficult thing about Aberdeen is, you know, it's a city divided at the moment, is Aberdeen, you know, and I think that's pretty well documented across the piece. I'm not necessarily a political person in any degree. I just very much like to look after my staff and my people and my family. But what would be great to see through the telescope, as it were, going forward, would be a landscape that had a city working for the benefit of a city collectively. You know, we do think, like, I think one of the best examples of something that's happened in Aberdeen in recent years has been the New Art Festival. And I'm not saying we need to be doing that every week, but it shows it can be done, and it shows there is a will, an underlying will there for things like that to be done. And I hope that stuff like that, events, can be embraced to allow us to try and use that cliche of building back better than where we were before COVID, because where we were before COVID as a city wasn't altogether that fantastic either.
No, I think we need to avoid the Aberdeen notion of being an elastic band and springing back to the way we were exactly. You know, we have to create a better future for everyone within the region. Sure, we're kind of out of time. I'm sure I speak for all the audience. I have thoroughly enjoyed chatting to you and getting an insight into what has been a very difficult time for the hospitality sector. And we are glad that you've got people like you who take a lead in the city so that the voice is heard, and that we hear these stories of resilience, and that there is a brighter future, because it would be quite easy to be, you know, pretty glum about what's going on right now. But I'm sure that this city has a brighter future if we can just navigate our way through this. So, Stuart, thank you very much for giving us that insight into your entrepreneurial approach to this the current pandemic. Thank you also to all the people who have attended this afternoon. I do hope you've taken a lot from that. We greatly value the role that businesses play within the university, the donors and alumni that support the university. And this year, if anything, has reinforced the significance and the vital role of a strong ecosystem. And I think if Aberdeen has got something, it has a hugely strong determination that we're very proud of. And we will look forward to seeing you at the next one of these lectures. But in the meantime, thank you, Stuart, for taking the time to be with us and giving us an insight. And to all of you in the audience, thanks again and take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.